Hello, welcome to the Charles River Conservancy Parkland Show. My name is Renata von Tscharner, President of the Charles River Conservancy, and we'll be talking about the wonderful parklands that we're so lucky to have here in Cambridge. And before I introduce our guests, I'll just walk us through the parklands and what you already know that the Conservancy does from the Boston Harbor up to the Watertown Dam. Our goal is to make the parklands more active, attractive, and accessible for all. And you might have heard about the skate park we're building under the Zaken Bridge ramps, about the swims we're organizing, about the Sunday Parkland Games, about our 2,000 volunteers, and about improving the pathways and adding underpasses. But another important part of our work is to continue the legacy of Charles Eliot. And we have two people here who will be talking about a little part of the parklands where Eliot had a vision and these two wonderful people had a new vision. I'd like you to meet Doug MacDonald, who was head of the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, MWRA, and then in 2007 you left for Seattle and became Secretary of Transportation there.
Right.
Welcome back to Cambridge, and I understand you're at MIT and you'll be talking about the course there. And welcome Nicole. Nicole Lobodzinski is a senior at Wellesley and also takes a course at MIT, an environmental science major. And the two of them met at MIT, and I'll let you tell the story and the area we'll be talking about.
Well, we met at MIT in a course that threw us together somewhat improbably, and were asked to look at an area of East Cambridge to think about its potential from landscape, which neither of us had an expertise in. And so we found this area, which is between the Longfellow Bridge and the Science Museum. Right along the river there, you can see the strip of trees and the four buildings. The Galleria Mall is off to the right, and you can see Kendall Square in the background. And Nicole can give you a little sense of how we developed interest in it and what it came to mean for us. But first, we'll look at a picture that shows where it is in the larger scheme of things.
So you went to that site and had a pretty strong reaction, I remember.
We might first just point out where you can see there the Longfellow Bridge to the right and the dam, and the area that we're talking about is pretty much just next to the dam on the Charles River side of the river, but that whole stretch of the river is where we focused our attention, and there you can see how it fits in the whole picture of the Lower Charles Basin and Boston Harbor.
So in between the Longfellow Bridge and then to the left would be the Museum of Science and the wonderful new North Point Parks and the Zaken Bridge. So it's a very prominent location marked by the Sonesta Hotel. And
yeah, we have a picture of that. We can show you how that looks. Look, Nicole, this, I think I took this next picture from the Longfellow Bridge. I don't know whether I was on the Red Line or whether I was just walking about, but.
Yeah, so Doug and I took a walk one day to look for an area that we were particularly interested in for our course, and we stumbled upon the Cambridge Parkway, and my initial impressions were, wow, this is very sad. Here's this prime property.
What did you say? This is very sad.
Very sad.
All right. Yeah.
So strong reaction indeed. And it was such a prime location. It was right along the river. There's a beautiful view of the Boston skyline, and there's hardly anyone there. There's a few joggers, a few walkers, but there really is no developed space. So as you can see in this photo, when the rain falls, it creates this kind of natural bioswale. It's this sort of muddy area. So it's really just not a developed area that the public can use and enjoy.
And here we have a picture.
Mm-hmm.
And then you took this picture from a roof garden.
Yes, this is on 55 Cambridge Parkway. It's an office space. Doug and I discovered a staircase there and climbed to the top and discovered this beautiful view of Boston. But there's a sort of ambiguous space there. Is it public? Is it private? Does it belong to the office? Can anyone access it? It's uncertain. And there's a patio, there's a couple tables, but it's really sort of outdated, and there's not really any indication for who can use that space.
And you can see in this picture, the trees obviously are in autumn, so there's not much leaves, so they don't show much. And then there's this strip of asphalt, a little asphalt, and a little sidewalk, and this little strip of grass. Here's this wonderful site, and nothing very much made of it.
And we have, here we see the hotel.
Right. So the hotel actually advertises that it has, 2 riverfront restaurants and all these things. And we were thinking, well, wouldn't it benefit them to develop this area to really be able to market that? And so that the visitors at the hotel could really enjoy this prime view, because right now it's very barren.
And this office building is it's kind of a forerunner of all the office development that's now going on around Kendall Square. And it's been there a while. We'll show a picture of that in a little bit, but it needs to up its game, and wonderful new things that could happen right at its front yard in the riverfront would help that and become an even more attractive office property.
So when you set up, you're going to work together on a project, did you set yourself a goal, or did you just try and find the area that intrigues you, that needs the most help, or kind of how did you pick that?
Yes, that's what we did. The class had a little goal to look at open space planning and water in the East Cambridge area. And then we found this open space, and most remarkably the water, namely the river, and off we went. So it selected us by virtue of walking around the neighborhood and seeing something that was a magnet for the interests that were in this class.
Yeah. And then, of course, as
well, this was
students
really
do, you
interesting.
started to look
This was
at
really
plans.
interesting because I wasn't familiar with all of this, but the first thing I found was the plan of the Charles Elliott Vision from 1897, which is on the left there in the picture. And Renata, that map hangs in your office.
Exactly, that's
And
the legacy we build upon.
This is the document of the legacy of Charles Elliott. And the piece of it that's of concern to us is just in the upper right-hand corner. And I found that there were a variety of details, not just on that map, but several others, that showed that Charles Elliott envisioned, as part of the entire system of reservations along the Cambridge side of the river, a park he called the Front. And it's marked in a couple of different iterations of how he thought at different points it might be designed. There's 2 more here. And interestingly, from some of the preoccupations that the Conservancy has about the future of the river, there was even a version of it that's shown on the right here, where a swimming beach
So
would have
this
been incorporated.
curved area was a swimming beach.
It was intended to be a swimming beach, and at that time, people swam in the river all the time. It was quite less developed than it is now.
Well, I think it's not that the river was necessarily cleaner. I think people didn't know it was dirty, but there was definitely a lot of swimming.
But you can go back more than 100 years and find the initial inspiration for ways that the river could be a rich recreational site.
Oh, yeah.
And so the question was, well, how to get from there to here, when here seems so disappointing compared to this piece, unrealized, of the Elliott Vision. And so that required us to look at it a little more. And I went back and learned a little bit, which I think many people are familiar with, about how the area at first was water. I mean, it was the Saltwater Estuary. You can see this on the left. And there's a line there that you can see the original harbor line, which is where the embankment now is. But all that was filled. But even at the time the dam was being built, which is the picture on the lower right, the notion of the park was still preserved. And that park is really interesting because if you go back in history, I found this little picture from the Cambridge Historical Society that shows that on the night that Paul Revere rode out to Lexington and Concord to tell them that the British were coming.
That's the bottom left image
On the
there.
bottom left, you can see, if you look carefully, that across that water is the dotted line where the British rode. And they took their boat over from the base of the Boston Common to Cambridge to ride to Lexington and Concord. Everybody wonders, well, how did 2 by sea, how did the British get to Concord by sea? Because there's not anywhere near the sea. And the answer is they rode across what was then a part of the sea, which
Because
was the Charles River.
it was salt water, it had no dam.
So this is this almost iconic site in American history and in American poetry because of Longfellow's poem. And it goes right under this area. And who would know today, because when you walk there, there's not a single sign of it. So we just got more and more interested in the area.
There's no interpretation there. Nothing there.
Nothing.
And it's not even part of the lore. I mean, people don't know it.
Well, everybody knows the poem.
Yes.
And everybody puzzles over how they got to Concord. Everybody knows that Paul Revere rode from Charlestown. If the British had won the war, they'd probably put the monument there. So it's just one of these little things about making history come alive, both from that standpoint and to remember that, that area of East Cambridge was all water once.
Yeah.
And has been filled.
Yeah.
So when we look at that in the next image, we get a little picture of how that happened.
Yeah.
I
So, we have this image still up of the front and of Eliot's plan. It's so interesting. Eliot, who kind of called the parklands the democratic common ground. And in a way, that has become part of the vision of the Conservancy, to make these parklands the democratic common ground.
Well, if you hold that thought till we get to the end, we can then ask you what you would do to do that, because
Right.
that's really where this presentation sort of ends. So hold that thought, because
Right.
it's terribly relevant.
All right.
So then what happened was the area was filled by the city of Cambridge, and they built the embankment. And today you can go down and see the embankment. It's really kind of a work of art, the wonderful granite blocks, although it's not as solid as it looks. And there is a real infrastructure challenge about work that will have to be done in the future there, particularly in light of climate change and the potential for sea level rise and surge, which gets a lot of attention. But you can see in the upper picture where the embankment was built. And I learned in the course of this, from your book, that the
Carl Hagelin's book.
Carl Hagelin's wonderful
Inventing
book,
the Charles River, yes.
which is a wonderful resource, just a rich source. That land was filled largely with the material that was excavated in the construction of the first section of the Boston subway between Park Street and Arlington and Boylston. So it's all connected.
So that what we see in the upper picture is the wall, the seawall, and I recall this is not standing on solid ground. It's really standing on wooden piles.
That is another and longer story, and one that I think needs to be told almost separately, because that goes to the question of how Cambridge has to prepare for climate change. Because if water goes over the top of that wall through a bad storm, that the whole scenario, Sandy comes to Cambridge, and a lot of speculation about that, but that wall may not be sufficient to do what it seems to do now, which is to protect the land from the lapping of the Charles River. But it's also a historic structure, also an expensive structure to fix, a concern I know DCR has about the future, but it just adds one more element to the puzzle of what can we take from this heritage space as we think about its future. So it's fun to go back and look at history as a way of thinking about the present.
So the area we looked at here is actually where there was a swimming beach planned by Charles Eliot. It was the very location.
That's the learning from looking at those old plans. Now, I haven't talked to him, but I did find some very interesting material from about 1904, 1905, when the Parks Commissioner, as this filling was going on, pointed out the importance of swimming to the neighborhood. And that, of course, then the wall got built, and then other things happened. So the question of where does swimming fit into recreational access to the river from the whole East Cambridge neighborhood isn't a new idea.
No, and
it's
Cambridge,
a 100-year-old idea.
Cambridge has done a riverfront plan. Their Department of Community Development, they created a riverfront plan, which was also, there was a program here on CCTV about that. And swimming is very much part of this effort to liven up that waterfront, which, as you pointed out, is underdeveloped and
we'll come
underappreciated.
We'll come back to that in a minute.
All right.
And these are other things that show some aerial views from just after the war. The buildings that are there now you can't see. They'd put a road right along the river's edge. It was sort of an extension of Memorial Drive. And during the war, that whole area was actually used for urban gardening, which is all the rage now. But who would think that, just going back to the time of World War II, the community was growing vegetables in victory gardens all along that area. And it was also being used for a road, and you can see where the Museum of Science was being constructed. I think we have one more picture that gives another sense of it.
Before we move on to the next picture, it's wonderful to see how the Museum of Science area was an open park, and at the top towards Boston is a little a rectangle, and that's a beautiful Oriental pavilion, which is still there, even after the museum has been built, and kind of reminds us of what kind of a beautiful park it was, and the elevated green line, the viaduct, the beautiful kind of created what Carl Hagelin called the Court of Honor, that was framed by this bridge and by the Longfellow Bridge. It was really a a very beautiful space.
And there's plans for this area, and there's also a history. And of course, this photograph has to be credited. We should have put it on here too. The very important director of the Museum of Science, Brad Washburn, who we all know took wonderful aerial pictures of mountains, and also these.
Yeah.
Everything kind of ties together. And this is, I think we have another picture here of the same area that shows how the roadway went along the river. But none of that's there today, although you can still see the electric plant.
And the cars are right on the water's edge.
But
Right.
that all changed.
Yeah, and that's actually what makes this space so unique as well. Is today it's one of the only places along the Charles River that doesn't have traffic, because there's parkways and highways going along most of the riverfront area. This is one of the few spaces where they don't have that intrusion. So it's a perfect place to have a recreational area.
And this picture shows how close it is to MIT in Kendall Square. And if you were to go just off to the left, you'd see that huge new development on Binney Street that everybody's excited about, where a lot of money is being spent. And so there's a lot of people who live there now and who will work and live there who are very close to this asset as a parkland.
Yeah, and we have a picture here from the planning that was done by Dennis Carlone, who is a city planner and is a city councillor now, and which moved the road away from the water and suggested to have really quite a rich parkland.
I've never talked to him, and I'd love to hear what some of his thoughts are about this today. But the Galleria Mall is there today. You can see what was then Commercial Avenue and is now Land Boulevard. And you can see a lot more trees on this plan from the mid-'70s than you'll see if you go there today. So between the mid-'70s and this actually being developed in the redevelopment in the 1980s, I don't think the place today is quite all of what it might have been in this model. But this is whence comes what you see on the riverfront there today, from the redevelopment plan that emerged in the 1970s and the 1980s.
So we're going to look at the picture next about how it looks today.
Yeah.
And I would love to kind of get your input, Nicole, of what intrigued you, what possibilities you saw in there.
Right. Well, you can see there's a front park along Cambridge Parkway. And this is where Binney Street ends, and it's the perfect space that sort of connects to the river, but there really is no connectivity there. There's no fluidity. So when a person comes to this park, the way that it's designed, it makes this kind of triangle, and there really is no direct path that should lead to the river. So this is another example of something that really strikes me as very sad. There's not much going on there, and it's a perfect green space. And this little park has been squeezed between two buildings, between the Esplanade and 55 Cambridge Parkway. And so it's the perfect space for people to use, whether they're living in the Esplanade or working at 55 Cambridge Parkway.
And it's interesting because they actually call this front park, which means Elliott hasn't been forgotten. But if you compare this tiny little thing to all of what Elliott envisioned, it's shrunk, it went through the dryer.
Yeah.
And then if you ask yourself, what does it look like when you get to the river? These are the two pictures on the right. The sad way of saying it is when you get there, there's no there there. The river hasn't become what it should be, which is the attraction, and all the things that could happen there are sort of neglected because you get to the park and there's nothing, there's a few joggers, but it isn't nearly the attractive destination that we'd like to think the river could be.
Yeah, and you have looked at that space, and it's the viewer, it's hard to see. So maybe, Nicole, you can tell us some of the ideas that you embedded into that area.
Yeah, so Doug and I had the creative space to sort of envision how we would renovate the area, and our thought was to implement green infrastructure, because what's going on in this image is you can see the Cambridge Marginal Conduit, which takes all the sewage to Deer Island, the water treatment plant, and there's a combined sewage overflow that exits directly into the Charles River. So during extreme rain events, the water is backed up and it's taken directly inside the river. So we were thinking of, what if we implemented bioswale? What if we used rain barrels on the buildings, and we could take that water and harness it and create a rain garden to prevent the water from going into the river. But there's many interpretations of how this can be done. The space really is open to a lot of ideas, and I think that's the interesting part. There's a lot of private and public and even independent interests, and I think that a lot of people would have a lot of ideas for what they would want to use for the space.
But Doug, what was your idea of where you would bring the swimming back here along this area?
Well, that would all depend on where you might have an opportunity to rebuild or reconfigure the seawall. Because if the seawall has to be rebuilt someplace along this stretch, you might be able to step it down to the water and make the water more conveniently accessible to people who are on the embankment. So, I mean, one of the things that's both fun and limiting about our exercise was we don't know how, we're not landscape architects. And I was very interested because of my sewage background in the fact that there is a combined sewer overflow there, and we know that's something we want to fix.
Sewage background, isn't that a wonderful term?
Well, yeah, I've got a sewage background. And so I was interested in the history of the big sewer that's under Land Boulevard and the little drainage that's right along the river.
Conduit,
Yeah, that's been there since the embankment was filled. And it's really an important piece of Cambridge's infrastructure today. It still functions. And then these buildings are sitting there, and their water that runs off the buildings is not used today the way, for example, the water will be used and managed coming off the Binney Street development. They're from a prior era. If we stepped forward and used modern concepts for how this might be used in green infrastructure, the possibilities are, they're multiple. But all kinds of people in the community would know more about this than we do.
Yeah, yeah.
And in a funny way, that brings us to the next
yeah,
thing.
well, we will. I think we will look at the next picture with your concrete suggestion. But in a way, by doing this collage and the ideas, in a way, it's an invitation to everybody to look at that area and come up with ideas, because it has a lot of potential. And there is one way that the East Cambridge Open Space Planning framed it, but that needs to be obviously expanded.
We should mention the name of the professor who we worked with in this is MIT, and his name is Jim Weskin. And he is very interested, as are a lot of people at MIT, in the East Cambridge Open Space Planning Study, and which is thinking about all kinds of issues. Well, we looked at the map for the study, and the map draws this red border kind of around MIT and Binney Street, and it touches the Charles River down by the bridge and where the light company is, but look at what it leaves out.
Leaves out the From Park, it leaves out
this entire, almost this entire area that we've talked about, where there is all this potential. And so if you ask yourself the question, how can you strengthen that whole area, this just cries out and says, come see me.
All right.
And there, but if people do go and see it, and they want to say something, the first thing we have to do is go see the East Cambridge Open Space Planning Study and say, let's move that red a little bit and make sure that we encompass the potential of, I mean, what is the greatest water feature in Cambridge? This is not a hard question.
There's several, but this is one of them.
Well, the river.
Yes.
I mean, there's fountains and there's things you can do, and water is a wonderful asset. But in Cambridge, the river is the biggest asset of all. This is why you're going to do underpasses. This is why you're interested in swimming. This is what the Conservancy is all about. And we think that bringing that focus into the Cambridge Open Space, East Cambridge Open Space Planning Study would be a real step ahead for visioning the future of this area. Yeah,
well, we're coming to the end of our program, and I want to thank Nicole and Doug for coming today and getting this idea out. We now need to take it from them. Well, you're going back to California, and you're going eventually back to Seattle. But it's wonderful that you came with your fresh view, and we're going to have another image.
Just to make one small point.
Yes.
This last image. Is there one more?
Yes, there is.
And it says, the sun does shine.
The sun does shine, exactly.
There's not only the potential for people and the water and the area and a better landscaping plan and a future that would invest in this area, but when the sun comes out on it, it really becomes a very attractive place.
Well, I feel the sun has come out tonight with your coming here. I want to thank you. And if in case you missed that program or just joined us, this program will be available on YouTube, on the website of the Charles River Conservancy. And if you are interested in volunteering or in swimming or any of our programs, support our underpasses, please come and let us know, because this is how we function, that we get feedback from people, we get support from people, we depend on support from people. So thank you for watching, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And come back often and give us your ideas. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.